Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us today, a brand new guest, a guy I'm excited to have on. I've been reading him for years. He's the guy that comes out and puts together a list of 10 reasons why the dollar's bad, or 18 reasons why the economy is worse than you think, or things like that. His name is Michael Snyder, and of course he is the creator and founder of the economiccollapseblog.com. Michael Snyder, coming to us from the West Coast of the United States. Thank you for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, another reason why I booked you is because of this, a book out just this year, just a few months ago, and it is called The Beginning of the End. And, of course, you have been writing all about the economic consequences here in America, the beginning of the end. Why should I be buying this book and read it, which is a hefty book? Why should people get out and buy this book?
Well, Greg, because it's the most important thing I've ever done. People are very familiar with my articles. Many of your listeners would be from the Economic Collapse blog, End of the American Dream. I've been writing about the decline of our economy. I've been writing about the emergence of the big brother police state we're seeing all around us. I've been writing about the political corruption and everything that I've been learning over the past several years about the direction this country is headed. I've tried to integrate that into this book, into this. And what it is, it's a novel. It's actually a fictional book. What I've done is I've integrated what I call truth bombs or nuggets of information into almost every chapter. So it's something you can give to a family member or a friend. And while they're being entertained by a mystery/thriller, very entertaining, a lot of people are really enjoying the book, but they're also waking up at the same time. They're being educated. They're getting all these nuggets of truth as they're reading the book. So, in terms of any article I've ever done, anything I've ever worked on, I consider this to be the most important thing I've ever done.
Are you having a hard time, as many people I have on here, I mean, the people watching this interview and the people coming to your site and my site know there's something dreadfully wrong, but many people do not. I mean, we're probably reaching a few percentage of people on your economics, collapseblog.com and USA Watchdog. Are you having a hard time with your family members and friends and people actually believing that there is something seriously wrong? We can't print money forever. Are you having a hard time getting through to people?
Well, I think there is a small segment that's waking up, but most of the population is still very apathetic. And this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, we look at the stock market. It's at an all-time high. The media says, oh, everything's great. The politicians say unemployment is going down. Oh, more people are going back to work. But actually, that's not accurate. And actually today, a news story just broke today in which a whistleblower came forward and said, hey, I was part of manipulating the employment numbers. And when you actually look at it, the only way they've gotten the unemployment rate to go down is by pretending that millions upon millions upon millions of Americans simply don't want to work anymore. They've driven down the labor force participation rate. They've decided that these long-term discouraged workers don't want a job anymore. And actually, if the labor force participation rate was exactly the same as it was when Obama was first elected, the unemployment rate in this country today would be 11%. Everybody would be talking about an economic depression. When is it going to end? But they've managed our perceptions. They've gotten us to believe, unemployment is going down. But if you look at the employment to population ratio, it has actually stayed almost entirely flat since the last recession ended. Just before the last recession, it was about 63%, or in other words, about 63% of all working age Americans had a job. Then during the recession, it fell from about 63% down below 59%, and it has stayed there for 50 months in a row. There's been no employment recovery at all. And this is the first time in the post-World War II era that the employment to population ratio, in other words, the percentage of people that actually have a job, this is the first time since World War II that number has not bounced back following a recession. So we've seen absolutely no employment recovery. And meanwhile, the next great wave of the economic crisis, I believe, is rapidly approaching.
What is the next? I mean, as a marker to that, I was thinking about the hearings with Janet Yellen. And she is the Fed chief out on the West Coast, I think in San Francisco, and she's going to become, the Ben Bernanke. She's going to take over Ben Bernanke's job, the top guy at the Fed, the top person, I should say, at the Fed, the top central banker here in America, the chief of the Federal Reserve. And something struck me about her testimony. Yeah, she said we were going to keep printing money, and that's not a big surprise. But what really struck me was I cannot remember ever, and I don't think it's ever happened, where a Fed chief is in a confirmation hearing, and they're standing on the fact that, we're going to print tons of money. We're going to print money we're not going to let the economy, we're going to print money. And I just think that is absolutely absurd for a Fed chief to come in and say, I'm going to be reckless as all get out. What's your take on this? And dovetail that into the next coming financial crash that you are predicting.
Yeah, what the Federal Reserve doing is utter insanity. We've seen the Federal Reserve balance sheet go from less than $1 trillion back before Lehman Brothers to now just under $4 trillion. So essentially what they're doing is they're monetizing U.S. government debt. But they claim they're not doing that because they claim that, all these assets we're accumulating, we're going to sell them back eventually. But which is a complete and utter lie. And the rest of the world is starting to catch on to this, because if they even threaten to slow down quantitative easing like Ben Bernanke did a number of months ago, that caused a massive financial panic. Wall Street started going crazy at just the suggestion that they would slow down the rate of these bond purchases just a little bit. So the idea that not only are they going to quit, but eventually sell back these trillions of dollars of bonds and mortgage-backed securities, it's utter insanity. But the U.S. government has to, and the Federal Reserve has to convince the rest of the world that this is going to be the case moving forward, that they're not actually monetizing debt. Because if they're actually monetizing debt and they start publicly admitting it, well, then all of a sudden we become the Weimar Republic. And the rest of the world is already looking at us and they're saying, wow, these people are going crazy. They're printing up money. And the rest of the world is starting to lose faith in our financial system, in the U.S. dollar. And this is the most important negative consequence of quantitative easing, not the short-term inflation, not some of the other things people talk about, but what the rest of the world is thinking. Because the rest of the world, they actually use more U.S. dollars outside of our country than we do inside the United States. Most people don't realize that, because the rest of the world uses the dollar to trade with one another. And in particular, oil, almost all oil throughout the world is traded in U.S. dollars. And so this is very important because it increases demand for U.S. dollars, keeps the value of the dollar up. And it also, these countries that accumulate huge piles of dollars, such as China, Saudi Arabia, they don't just sit on those piles of dollars. What they do is they reinvest much of that money into U.S. debt, into U.S. Treasury securities. So that increases the value, the demand for our debt, and keeps interest rates low. So both those things are very, very good for us. Now, if the rest of the world decides someday we're not going to use the U.S. dollar anymore, we're going to go to something else, or we're going to start moving away from the U.S. dollar in a significant manner, then all of a sudden demand for the dollar drops, demand for our debt drops. We have a real hard time selling our debt. Interest rates throughout our economy explode. All kinds of bad things start happening. So it's absolutely critical that the rest of the world keeps playing along. But as long as the Federal Reserve is printing money, they're endangering the whole game. They're endangering the whole system. So they've got to stop at some point, or at some point the rest of the world is going to say no more. We're not going to participate in this charade.
So how do you envision the coming? You think that we're having a collapse, for sure. And that's what the data you look at. This is what I like about your articles. You'll say something, and here's a link. You'll say something, and it's a quote, and here's a link. I love that, because that's kind of what I do. That's a journalism thing, so people can stand on what you're saying and don't think, oh, wow, it's not Crazyville. So how do you think that this collapse is going to unfold, in the coming, weeks or months or years? What's the timing? What's it going to look like?
Right. Well, most people who talk about a coming economic collapse, they kind of hype it up as some type of big Hollywood event, which is going to happen in a few weeks, a few months. It's going to be over, and then we're going to rebuild. I view things differently. I consider the economic collapse something that has been happening, is happening right now, will continue to happen, and it's a steady decline, which will be punctuated by moments of crisis, such as we saw back in 2008. But the truth is we've been declining for a long time. We've seen median household income go down for 5 years in a row. The number of Americans on food stamps back in the year 2000, it was 17 million. Obama is elected, it was 32 million. Now it's 47 million. Or you look at the number of working age Americans that do not have a job since the year 2000. The total number of working age Americans without employment has increased by 27 million when you add all the categories together. So things have been declining steadily. However, I do believe another great wave is coming, similar to 2008, but even worse. And I'll partly explain why. If you look at, people remember back in 2008, they think the problems were fixed. The problems were not fixed.
So wait a minute, hold on. I hate to interrupt you, but so you're saying all this money printing, these trillions of dollars that they have printed, QE1, QE2, Twist, and now Infinity, that didn't fix anything. We don't have anything fixed at all.
Not at all. The Federal Reserve, they've used up, all their ammunition. They've gone all out. But we haven't seen a recovery. Meanwhile, the federal government, under Barack Obama, the debt of the U.S. government is projected to more than double. In other words, under Barack Obama, we're going to accumulate more new debt than we did under all the other presidents and all of U.S. history combined. But one of the biggest problems, as I was going to mention, is the big banks. Over the past 5 years, the too big to fail banks, the 6 largest banks in this country, I'm talking about Goldman Sachs, I'm talking about Citibank, I'm talking about Bank of America, the 6 largest banks over the past 5 years have gotten 37% larger. Meanwhile, 1,400 smaller banks have completely disappeared from the system. So too big to fail is now bigger than ever. Meanwhile, these big banks have become more reckless with their money and our money than ever before. Most people don't realize this, but Wall Street has become transformed into the biggest, most reckless casino in the history of the world. Of those 6 too big to fail banks that I just mentioned, 4 of them have total exposure to derivatives in excess of $40 trillion. That's each one. Once again, I'm talking about Goldman Sachs, Bank of America. They're up to their eyeballs in these side bets, in this gambling. And of course, the biggest chunk of it is interest rate derivatives. According to the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks based in Switzerland, they say that globally, there's the total amount of interest rate derivatives around the world is approximately $441 trillion. Now, keep in mind the GDP of the United States is somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 trillion, somewhere around there. So when you're talking about $441 trillion, you're talking about an amount of money that is absolutely unimaginable.
That's just for interest rate derivatives. That doesn't count all the derivatives. And some people say all the derivatives, Bank of International said on 630 some odd trillion, all the derivatives, some people say it's more than twice that. So it's a massive exposure. You don't have a lot of room for making a mistake to wipe out your capital, right?
Oh, absolutely. These banks are leveraged to the hilt. And as you mentioned, some people estimate the total amount of all derivatives of all types is close to $1.5 quadrillion. And so most of the time, this game stays fairly well balanced and the banks are able to make a good bit of money off of it. But if we see a major event or if we see a huge spike in interest rates when the Federal Reserve starts tapering quantitative easing or some big event that comes along that destabilizes the system, all of a sudden the carefully balanced calculations and models that these big banks depend upon, they go haywire, they fall apart. Like we saw in 2008, things can get really bad very quickly.
Well, tell me about how this downgrade of some of these big banks that just happened, which I was kind of stunned that they downgrade some of these big banks. And one of them was J.P. Morgan, which they're, in the process of hammering out a deal for $13 trillion. And the mainstream media says how they handled mortgages. Well, you're talking about securities fraud. We're talking about foreclosure fraud. You're talking about massive amounts of fraud with the banks. But some of these big banks just recently got downgraded. How does that factor into your collapse scenario?
Well, I think, people are starting to wake up and realize, and they're saying, well, hey, hold on a second. It looks like we're in a bubble situation, with some of these big banks. They're being reckless. They're being irresponsible. And these big banks, the 6 largest banks that I mentioned, they account for 42% of all loans of all types in the United States. And our entire economic system is based on credit. on the flow of capital, on people being able to get loans, to pay their employees, to order inventory, whatever the case is. So if those banks were to collapse and go down, all of a sudden people wouldn't be able to get loans. The flow of money would be severely restricted, and we would see 2008 on steroids. So people need to realize, it's kind of like, yeah, these big banks are evil, but we're so dependent on them, and we're so tied into them. It's kind of like a cancer patient where the cancer has spread so much through the body, and that if you try to kill the cancer, you're going to kill the patient too. That's the situation we're in today.
So you're saying basically if we try to fix the banks, we'll kill the economy. So you're saying the economy is going to have to get killed if we ever have a chance to resurrect it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, Greg, we're living in the greatest debt bubble in the history of the planet. If you go back 40 years ago, the total amount of debt in our system, government debt, corporate debt, the debt of these banks, consumer debt, 40 years ago, it was about $2 trillion. Today, it is more than $56 trillion. So over the past 40 years, the total amount of debt in the system has gotten more than 28 times larger. And all this debt has fueled a great boom of prosperity, but it's been a false prosperity. It's been fueled by debt. And at some point, we're going to pay the price. A day of reckoning is coming, and unfortunately, is rapidly approaching.
Is Obamacare, speaking of rapidly approaching here in 2013 and 2014, is that going to kind of, push the wagon down the hill a little faster?
Yeah, I've called it the final nail in the coffin of the middle class. The middle class today, it's being stretched, it's shrinking, more people are falling into poverty. And one recent survey found that 76% of all Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, they're just barely surviving from month to month, doing whatever they can to get by. Meanwhile, now here comes Obamacare. Millions of people are having their policies canceled. In fact, Forbes is projecting eventually 93 million Americans are going to lose their current health insurance policies. And those policies are being replaced with much more expensive policies with much higher deductibles. They're saying on average, men are going to pay higher premiums of 99% higher premiums under Obamacare, and women an average of 62%. And certain groups are going to get hit harder than others. For example, they're projecting that healthy single men, 30 years old, will pay on average 260% more for their health care premiums. And one family down in Texas, an elderly family down in Texas, just for an example of how extreme this can be, they were paying a little over $200 a month for their health insurance, which was pretty good. Their policy got canceled. Their health insurance company said, okay, we can get you a new policy, but it's going to cost you $1,356 a month. And they can't afford that. They're just a middle-class family trying to get by. But somehow these middle-class families are going to have to find from somewhere money to pay for these health insurance policies, and that's going to take money out of their spending in other areas.
Well, do you think that this is going to be a big backlash for the Democrats? I mean, are the Republicans going to get in there, and is it going to make a difference in 2014?
Well, unfortunately, as we've seen over the past couple of decades, whoever has been there, things continue to kind of go down the same road no matter who's in there, whether it's Bush, whether it's Obama. They keep racking up all of this debt. They keep it, going along with the madness that the Federal Reserve has been promoting. Pretty much whoever's in there, things continue to get worse. They continue to ship millions of our jobs overseas. So changing politicians, unfortunately, I don't think is going to solve much of anything. Bush was a terrible president. Now Obama's even worse. And who knows, the next president could be even worse than Obama, if you can believe that. But, unfortunately, I don't see a lot of hope on the horizon at this point.
So how do people protect themselves individually then? If we can't do it by a group or by a political movement, at the moment, and this is what I tell people too, about all you can do is kind of protect yourself. What do you tell your friends and family to say, hey, you ought to do what?
Right. And that's a big thing with me. I'm encouraging people to get prepared for the coming storm on an individual, a community, and a family level. And some of the things are just make common sense. You look back at 2008, millions of people started to lose their jobs. And because they didn't have anything to fall back on, they couldn't make their mortgage payments. And millions of people lost their homes. So I'm encouraging people to have an emergency fund, have something to fall back on. So if you lose your job, your business starts hurting, you'll be okay as you figure out what to do. You know, another thing that I'm encouraging people to do is a common sense thing. Learn how to grow a garden. Learn how to, so as food prices go up, you know, thanks to Federal Reserve money printing, you know, you can insulate yourself a little bit. Anything you can do to become more self-sufficient and independent of the system is a good thing. You know, starting a side business, you know, putting up alternative sources of energy for your home to insulate yourself against that. Storing up food, getting gold and silver over the long term, I think are fantastic ways. There's going to be huge ups and downs in the short term with gold and silver. Over the long term, I think those are great things to do. Anything you can do to insulate yourself and become more independent of the system, I think is a really good thing.
All righty, and my last thing, I'm going to ask you a hard question. Prediction for 2014. Is this going to be a pivotal year in the next leg down in what your book is saying, the beginning of the end?
Yeah, I wrote the novel actually with 2014, 2015, 2016 in mind, kind of trying to paint a picture of where we're headed. I'm extremely concerned about this next 2-year time frame. You know, I'm extremely concerned about what's going to happen when the Federal Reserve decides to start tapering quantitative easing or stop the political wrangling in Washington, D.C. You know, as the rest of the world, they've already started to move away from the U.S. dollar. As that accelerates, Obamacare, there's so many things, but I think that I'm extremely concerned. I think the next crisis, a similar crisis to what we saw in 2008, this next 2-year time frame, I'm extremely, extremely concerned about. I believe that a similar crisis, although even worse, is coming. Millions of people are going to eventually lose their jobs. I believe we're eventually going to see rioting and looting, an increase in crime. We already saw violent crime increase by 15% last year in America. All these things are coming. And so, I want people to start listening for these things and listening for a derivatives crisis or a problem with the derivatives. When you start hearing that in the mainstream media, you know it's late in the ball game.
Michael Snyder, of course, your book out this year, The Beginning of the End. Michael Snyder from the economiccollapseblog.com. Great guest, man. Hope you come back. Thanks for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
Thank you, Greg. It was great to be on.